Welcome to the Tech 45 podcast. I'm your host, Jack Ryan. Today I have the privilege and honor to interview one of my former colleagues and friend, Stefan. Stefan, do you mind introducing yourself for my 8 listeners?
Yeah, my name's Stefan Elsener. I'm a senior program management manager in product development in the robotics industry.
Excellent. And so just to frame up the conversation for people that don't know Stefan, him and I worked together in a previous role. And I had the pleasure of interacting with multiple customers and then internal R&D staff at the organization we worked at. And I just really enjoyed working with Stefan. And it's ironically enough, the majority of the time we worked together was during COVID. So
Right.
I think I probably have more time talking to you like in this type of format, in a teleconference format setting via the various platforms we used than I do have in person. We've spent some time in person, but a lot of the time I've gotten to know you has been like this. So it's
Right.
kind of interesting. I wanted to start the discussion because I value your opinion, and this is probably one of the, I don't want to say most important, but one of the most impactful decisions that an American in the modern era can make. And that is Android or iOS, and why?
Oh, wow. I'm Android all the way. I dabbled with
Yes.
iOS back in college when it was the cool thing to do, right? The new iPhones were coming out. I wasn't the first in line, but I think I picked up was it the 3G or something? It was like the
Yeah, it
second
was.
or third iteration,
Yeah.
and just could not get on board with it. It was felt very restricting. Like if you didn't want to think about it and it just worked out of the box and you just followed the playbook, then great. But I wanted to be able to meddle and change things and customize, and the workflow just didn't fit for me. So I switched to Android and haven't looked back.
Yes, that's the answer I wanted. Yeah, I was, and my first smartphone, and then probably my next 2 smartphones were all Android operating system based phones, and I share the same sentiment. John Shusius, one of my previous guests, who's just an incredible human being and kind of has a mind like yours, he said it best, and him and I were talking about it, not on the podcast, but kind of before we started recording, we talked about it. And he said, and we talked about it, like Android kind of gets to know you. It gets to know you. I think if people they gave Android a try, and really used it deliberately for a week or two, they would the settings would tailor to their interests. Unlike Apple, God love them. I think Apple's an incredible company, great for the American economy, but Apple doesn't give you all the same options that Android does. They kind of, the hardware and software integration is so tightly knit that it kind of puts you in a, I don't want to say in a corner. That's going to sound mean. Sorry, Tim Cook, but it kind of like, it doesn't leave you for a lot of additional functionality and customization. I don't know.
It also feels like you're either all in or you're not. And in in my career as an engineer, I've always been Windows machines because that's where the tools lived, right? CAD packages and such. And I know in the latter years you can dual boot Macs and everything, but I was kind of all Windows. And so then having a Windows machine with an iPhone, you didn't really get the full benefit of the ecosystem like the more creative industries, your video editing software and such. And I've done video editing and stuff too, and coursework, and Macs were always part of the recipe there. But since then, it's been Windows and Android mostly.
Yeah, that's the exact direction I'm gravitating towards. My last couple of work phones at previous companies I've worked at have been Apple devices that were issued to me. So I kind of got sucked into the Apple ecosystem for several years, but now I'm getting myself out, which is actually the ecosystems are kind of converging. A lot of people don't realize this, but I would say from my experience personally, Apples are becoming more open to Google and other forms of alternative operating systems as far as the integration, and then Android seems to play better with Apple products too, from my experience, and Windows for that matter. Windows was kind of like the missing link, but I think the software engineers at those amazing multi-trillion-dollar companies are kind of starting to realize that they have to be able to do that.
Some sort of standard that they can play in the same sandbox
Yeah.
with.
Yeah, exactly. So that's anyway. I wanted to get your take on that, and not to surprise you with that question, but
Yeah.
can you, for the listeners that haven't done hardcore engineering like you have, can you explain what CAD is from your perspective for someone who's like not an engineer? Like we're talking like not any exposure to engineering.
Yeah. At the base level, it stands for computer aided design. And I'm a mechanical engineer by training. So SolidWorks, Pro E, Creo, uh, those sorts of packages where you're doing 3D modeling, creating an assembly of parts in digital space to uh, figure out all the interfaces and intricacies of a given product or piece of equipment before spending money on physical real world parts. And that's just the mechanical space. You can there's electrical CAD as well, where they're designing PCBs. Um, Architects use it, right? Like the digital design space is so powerful anymore that nobody is doing anything either on paper or uh, kind of in the modeling space. I don't want to say nobody. Anywhere where there's like a touchy feely aspect, the modeling still, the physical modeling still has a lot of value. Particularly in the automotive industry, you see they're still doing clay models and trying to figure out what are the exact curves of body panels on a car that speak to you.
Yeah, yeah,
Or in user interfaces, I've seen that a lot too, where they'll do cardboard 9000 mock-ups and then get into 3D printing and urethane casting and get 99% plus look and feel out of a rapid prototyping method to feel out that that connection between a human and a object.
totally. That was a really good answer. That was a really succinct explanation for people that are not in, if they're not an architect or not an electrical engineer, mechanical engineer. So the computer aided design has really expanded to all facets in the modern day world. Whether you're designing a football stadium, so think like a massive football stadium that's going to seat 100,000 people. That can start in a computer where you can get the dimensions correct and look at the landscape and the property you're planning to build, and then everything from the foundation, the plumbing, all of that can be modeled in a 3D computer space on either a laptop or a desktop, all the way down to, let's use another example, an iPhone, all the way down to an iPhone where you can design the electronics and the printed circuit board that goes into this device. That can all be modeled in a computer aided design tool like Stefan's describing. So that's just amazing. And one of the things that's really cool is the mock-up you kind of just mentioned. I kind of want to pull on the thread and take our listeners back in time to when before the era of computer aided design. What fascinates me and amazes me is I was at the Marine Corps Museum a few weeks back, and they have an awesome display about World War II and how the Marines fought in World War II. But some of the bombers that were invented during World War II were designed before the advent of any of these computer aided design tools. So no SolidWorks. I mean, they were using essentially graph paper and slide rules. And like, how did they design those aircraft? Like even the SR-71, one of the fastest aircraft that's ever been thought of. Like how did they design those aircraft before ECAD tools, before
A
CAD tools?
lot of people and a lot of pencils and erasers. There's some fun historical pictures, NASA with Saturn V, and you mentioned SR-71. Any of those kind of first generation aerospace efforts, there's pictures of just these massive rooms with drafting tables and 50 to 100 engineers with pencil and paper drawing out what they intended to build.
Yep.
And manpower aside, the fact that they were able to make these machines that worked reasonably well in that method, just thinking about the parallel or lack of parallel processes available like you would in CAD, where I can have my electrical designer and my mechanical designer working within the same coordinate space with some interfaces defined, whether it's a zero position or some extents dimensions or whatever it may be. They can refine their design in parallel with very little overlap or interference. Whereas if you're designing a part on paper, until you get both parts drawings together and try and interpolate through tolerance stack ups, a bunch of math maybe, you don't know for sure that it's going to work until you actually make the physical part and try and put it together.
Yeah, you're totally right about that. And this, I was pulling up a picture I'm gonna share with the people that are viewing this on video format. This is a painting because they're honestly this was a really top secret program back in the day. And so let me see if I can get this up. Oh yeah, here we go. This is so cool. This is such a cool picture. So this is a painting. You know, this is probably taken from someone's memory because this was a highly compartmentalized program back in the '60s, '60s and '70s, I think. And so what's cool about this is just like Stefan was describing, it took a lot of manual effort and a lot of engineers, technicians, and then probably a lot of repetition on with a pencil and an eraser to design the SR-71 Blackbird and all of its components. I think what amazes me the most is that they were able to design these Pratt engines in such an elegant, efficient manner. I mean,
Right.
I think that engine, last time I checked, it was like 85 or 88% efficient, which is like a marvel in modern engineering even today. But you know, it required that because of not only the fuel consumption, but the fact that this was going so fast. You had to deal with supersonic airspeeds coming in through the inlet. Anyway, I'm sorry to nerd out on the
And
SR-71, but
that was before the advance of advanced CFD,
oh my gosh,
right?
stop. Okay, tell the listeners about that because that's a whole nother like topic.
CFD is what computational fluid dynamics, where digitally you can assess airflow through a system, or fluid flow is actually a better way to put it because it could be liquids or gases. And today I could do that pretty easily on my laptop. If with a simple system, I can induce a fluid flow and see where turbulence spots might be, or how to refine inlets and outlets and different paths for the fluid. But back in that time frame, you could do the math. The math is the same. That hasn't changed in the last 100 years. But you would have to either do a scale build, sub full scale mock-up, ideally functional, and put it in a wind tunnel, and then try and interpolate up to what the full scale dynamics might be, which aren't always one-to-one depending on the different performance regimes you're working in. And I know I'm not an expert in this by any means, but I know when you get into the approaching supersonic and beyond, right, a lot of the math starts to fall apart. All the assumptions start to move around, and so it became this experimental, iterative process to try and refine those.
No, totally. I think it's so cool. Yeah, the CFD aspect of it is so cool because they had to come up with unique fuels, and I think the fuel that powered those Pratt engines, I think the J58 engines, I think it also served as so it not only served as a fuel, but it cooled aspects of the engine. So I mean, fuel transfers heat. I mean, they had to be the type of fuel that they were after had a very very high flashpoint, as you can imagine. Just like it was still a kerosene derivative, but it was a much more refined version of what was used then, and is kind of what used today is like Jet A or a higher level of JP8. So it intentionally wouldn't burn until it got to a super hot, a high, really really high heat, and that's just how the plane had to operate if it was going to operate safely. And what's kind of cool, one more detail, and then I'll change topics. But they had, this was before of like portable air starters like they have today. So now, if you want to start a big aircraft on the ground, you have an electric powered air cart which will spool up the engine, because in order to get enough airflow in the turbine, in the turbofans, which turbofans are widely adopted with commercial aircraft and military aircraft alike, you have to get enough airflow in the engine before you add the fuel. Otherwise, the engine can overheat. That's the most critical point, is when you start a turbine engine, you have to get enough airflow in there. So you have to get that turbine spooled to a certain RPM, really, certain speed. And I know you'll appreciate this because of some of the vehicle choices I know you've made in the past. They used two V8 engines to spool up each engine, which is so
Yeah.
cool. So this, at the time, it was the Buick Wildcat 400 engine, and they tried to do it with just one, but it wouldn't work. So they just strapped two engines, put two massive V8 engines together, and then that's what spooled up the SR-71 engine. And I don't know about you, but I still have an affinity for a naturally aspirated V8 engine. I think there's something beautiful about it.
We must have been reading the same article recently because I read something about Buick Wildcat engines that were consumed by this program, where they basically pulled every engine out of every scrapyard in the country
Every
to
single one.
try and support the program, and then finally had to switch over to a Chevy small block type
Yep.
of engine.
Oh, I would have loved to go back. So if I could go back in time, I would love to be on the ramp at whatever secret airport in California that this thing was designed in, and just I would love to not only hear that Buick Wildcat engine spool up and start, but then just rev up at a high RPM. They probably max that thing out. Two of them, not just one, but two. That would be an amazing sound for a gearhead like me. And then to hear that engine spool up in a test cell, oh my gosh, it gets me excited thinking about it, because like those are like two of my favorite things, like high octane, high power engines, whether it be in a motorcycle or a boat or a car, and then jet aircraft, so jet engines. So it's like my two favorite types of motors together in one, and supporting each other, which is really cool. But yeah, they consumed every single Wildcat engine, which is kind of funny. It's it's when the DoD gets fixated on something, and there's enough money and engineering talent poured into it. I mean, there's really nothing that can't be accomplished from my
Right.
perspective. So. And you kind of had an affinity for, just based on what you've told me before, you had an affinity for RC planes growing up. I don't know around what age you kind of started gravitating towards machines that you could potentially design and build.
I was always interested in RC and walkie-talkies and the thought of being able to control something that I wasn't sitting in.
Yep,
But growing up, it wasn't that mature yet. I don't know if you remember getting an RC car or something for Christmas, and
I
you're
do.
like, great, I'm gonna go play with it. I'm like, oh, well, we didn't buy batteries for it. Or the
Always.
the early
Yeah.
rechargeable batteries, you got like 5 minutes of runtime for 2 hours of charging or something like that. And nowadays you can get, it's almost the inverse. Charge it for a few minutes and my kid can go play around with it for 30 or 40 minutes. No problem. But yeah, back then, um, and it was relatively expensive too. So it was kind of a niche hobby. So I wouldn't say as a kid I got into it, but in college, when I was going to University of Colorado, they participated in the AIAA, which is the American Institute for Aeronautics, Astronautics, kind of professional group, sponsored every year a college level RC aircraft competition. And they would put out, this is called Design, Build, Fly. So they would put out this mission, these rules, and there would be some score or some calculation that determined your score. And so one year was you had to be able to carry with one aircraft a payload of some number of tennis balls, or 2 liters of water, bottles of water, and or some number of bricks. And so what it did is it forced you to try and optimize your aircraft to achieve the highest score, which was calculated in such a way that incentivized you to be able to develop this flexible payload system to fly a known circuit around an airfield. Usually it was like take off, climb, do a 180-degree turn, do a 360-degree turn somewhere on the straightaway, and then do another 180-degree turn to come back down the runway. And some years it was how many laps can you do before you run out of batteries. Some years it was how fast can you do a fixed number of laps. So like every year it was a little bit different in how they incentivized you to optimize your system, whether it was for speed and power or longevity or lightweight airframe or smallest airframe. And it was really fascinating to me to try and optimize in that design space, which is where I kind of got in. I kind of nurtured that remote control type of product development, but really that systems level thinking on how do you develop something from the ground up to meet some set of requirements.
Oh, that's so cool. Approximately how old were you back then when you were doing
This
this?
is this is college age, so I
Oh my
was,
gosh.
18 to I was a super senior in college, so I got to do this for a few more years.
Okay, that is so cool. I mean, that's amazing. I mean, I wish more people would get involved in that. I mean, even at an earlier age. And one of the things that you shared with me that just was so impactful. I think we talked about this last weekend. Is how do we get kids, not just college kids, but like kids, elementary school age, middle school age. How do we get involved? How do we get them involved in robotics or unmanned systems, either at a hobby level or in a more formalized, let's say robotics club. You shared something that was really impactful for the way that I, frame up the way that I raise my children. And I was, in this podcast, I was thinking this podcast would be all about technology and human machine interface. And the more I do it, I'm realizing the machines are not always the most interesting. It's the people that design and control the machines that are interesting. And so I was thinking to myself when you brought up the robotics club for kids, for like our sons, I was like, oh yeah, it'd be great to get kids exposed to STEM, science and technology, engineering and math at a young age. And you said something that was impactful to me. You said that yeah, that's important, but you're really trying to utilize robotics and complex design as a mechanism to make our kids more resilient. Arguably, that's a better life skill, I would say, because the technology will change by the time they're ready to get a job or start their own company. The technology will be way different. AI will definitely be a factor in how we design things, but resiliency is a really a critical skill that will benefit you your whole life, no matter what you do. Could you speak more on how we could potentially raise more resilient kids here in the U.S.?
Something that's resonated with me on this topic is, and I'm gonna zoom out just a little bit first, is the idea that generationally technology evolves and the quote unquote older generations are not able to keep up. That's the stereotype, right? As you've probably heard our parents or grandparents say, like, "Oh, that's for you kids. That's beyond me."
Yeah.
And I think back in the 50s when we talk about the SR-71 and such, technology didn't move as fast. Yes, we were doing high tech and innovative things, but if you think about what a car looked like, uh, or what a radio looked like, or what a television looked like, these, and even just simple appliances, microwaves and dishwashers and such, that stuff came along on maybe a generational or at best a half generational time frame. And
Yeah.
so you could kind of accept that, well, I didn't learn about that, so that's for your generation, and my generation is almost done, so I don't need to dive into that and become an expert. But now the pace of innovation is happening at such a speed that if you accept that the only thing you're going to be comfortable with is what you learned in your 20s and that you're going to ride that into retirement, you're going to miss 3 or 4 cycles of innovation and you're not going to be able to even participate, let alone keep up with it. So going back to the resilience piece is I'm and I'm not an educator. I'm I'm a I'm not an expert in anything. I'm kind of this jack of all trades. It's just kind of observant. But my goal for my kid is that, and children in general, is that they're able to keep up with that pace. And for me, resilience is a good way to frame it, because it's all about seeing challenges, not being surprised that a challenge exists. You can be surprised at the specifics of the challenge, but I don't want you to be surprised that a challenge happened, because
Yeah,
that's a given, right? And um, what's the adage? The only guarantee in life is change. Like, things
it's
are going to
true.
change, and we need to roll with the punches and be willing to learn new things and figure out the next step forward. And I think if we can instill those life skills, no matter what the focus is, right? It could be the arts, it could be STEM, it could be business, finance, whatever. The way we do things and the way we interact with the world will change. And in our kids' lifetime, it probably will turn over more times than it did in our lifetime, and definitely more times than it did in our parents' or grandparents' lifetimes.
Undoubtedly. Wow. Yeah, these are such great fundamentals to instill in our kids that things will change. You will have to deal with either setbacks or becoming familiar with a new technology, process, procedure that you're unfamiliar with, and it's so obvious that you're not. You really don't have any hesitancy to take on a new challenge. That because I've worked with you on this, and that's one thing that you've really always been able to be really good at is inspire the team to say, no, this is possible. And we can explore different design paths to come up with a solution that makes sense. And yeah, and I'm always trying out new things and looking at how technology can improve not only my business life, but my personal life too, and make me more productive, make me kind of leverage my own abilities as my schedule gets more and more busy as I progress through my career and have more and more kids, and there's more and more commitments in life, and you got to run a house and you got to take care of your kids, and yeah, I'm always looking for things that can I can leverage to aid me in my journey. And that's so cool what you said. I mean, there's a lot of truth in that. I think technology is like certainly going to accelerate, like you said, and our kids are. I think it's going to be unfathomable to us, like you and I sitting here right now on StreamYard, for us to predict what the world is going to look like in 20 years is it's hard for me to even fathom like what life's going to be like. I mean, do you have any predictions that you've thought of that may or may not happen? I'm taking a guess.
I think there's certain elements of life that won't look that different, right? Like, we're still humans, and I don't know if you've ever seen one of those charts on like the time scale of the universe, and if
I'm
you
trying to
mapped it
think.
to a clock, like 24
Oh,
hours is the history of the world, not even the universe, just Earth. And humans have only existed in, like, I'm going to probably butcher this, but for argument's sake, in like the last minute
yes,
of the
yes.
24-hour clock of the world.
I have heard
So,
that comparison.
so when you say 20 years, evolution doesn't move that fast, right? So like, there's certain things that are still going to be similar. Like, we're not going to all be eating slurries and living on space stations in 20 years. Um, the whole, like, setting up a colony on Mars, yes, it's ambitious and it's interesting, but I don't believe there's going to be, 1 million people on Mars in 50 years type of thing. I think we'll make incremental progress towards some of those things, but there are certain technology advances that will be limited by human evolution type of timescales. But how we move through life and the type of tools available to us, the speed of information, potentially speed of travel, um, that kind of stuff, I think will definitely evolve, right? What your day to day life looks like, or how you interact with it, maybe will evolve.
Oh, totally. Can we talk about clocks for a second since you brought it up? I wasn't
Sure.
planning on bringing this up, But are you aware? I'm sure you are. I know the answer to this, I think. Let me pull this picture up for the folks that are watching. Look at this clock. This is one of the most expensive clocks ever made. It's a clock that Jeff Bezos and one of his teams built underground I think it's in a mountain in Texas. Have you heard about this clock? The
Oh,
10,000 year clock?
is this the one that doesn't lose accuracy over 10,000 years or something like that?
Precisely.
Yeah.
How does this make you feel when you see like a modern mechanical marvel like this? I don't think there's any electronics associated with this. Maybe to measure it. I'm sure there's measurement devices, but I think the goal is to make it so it doesn't need any electronic inputs. As a mechanical engineer by trade, which I think you are, right? How does it make you feel when you see something like this?
It's interesting because we take for granted things like time measurements and even weight or mass measurements. Like there's like the gram and the pound. To some degree, those are arbitrary ways that humans have come up with to make all the math of the universe work out. And keeping a standard for those things that persists indefinitely is hard. I know, departing from time a little bit, I know there's standard weights and measures, right? That a gram has a definition, and it's this piece of platinum sitting in a vault somewhere is what a gram is, and how do you define it otherwise?
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
and
Okay. Yeah.
time is similar. Even the calendar is something I think about is why is the calendar the way it is? It's just because humans decided that's how it's going to be. It would make way more sense to have 13 months, 28 days each with no leap years. And then every month is the same length, right? Why do we need to have different days in each month? But 24 hours is not the exact duration of an Earth day. And over millions of years, that changes too with the way the moon drifts around, right? So like the concept of time and weight is a function of our current existence.
Whoa.
And in millennia, there's a good chance it'd be different, or on a different planet, it would be different.
That is really cool. Yeah, I was fascinated about this. I mean, Jeff Bezos has had a pretty successful career, so he's been able to fund projects like this, whether it be sending humans to space or coming up with a 10,000 year mechanical clock. And even before I saw this clock, I was always fascinated with watches that require no electrical signal at all to
Mm-hmm.
function. I think spending time in the military, that kind of people kind of go two directions, and they either go with an electric battery powered watch that has a really super low power draw and that it'll just last for like 10, 15 years. That's what
Mm-hmm.
I had in the military. That's what most people have. And then some of the more elite units like to get more bespoke with their watches, and they have to be able to operate in extreme environments, extreme heat, cold, altitude, underwater depth. Even in space, we have Navy personnel who've been spent long periods of time in the space station. Scott Kelly comes to mind. I think he spent the better part of 6 months or more in the space station. So those are all factors that play into how you design mechanical timepieces. And I always thought it was cool that either whether you manually wind it or you have some sort of automatic movement that uses the movement of your wrist and body to wind the watch. I always thought that was cool. I mean, I think that's something that humans have always been curious about. How do you keep track of stuff? How do you measure stuff? And that goes into the financial system. After the advent of bartering, how do you keep track of money and how do you store wealth, if you call it, or value? And I forgot about the connection about how you measure a gram as far as how you measure mass, and the fact that there's probably like a dialed in gram of platinum somewhere in a vault that's in a humidity temperature controlled environment is really fascinating to me. I think it's cool that you brought up that example.
Well, and then, the 10,000 year clock, I start to think humans and technology and machines haven't been around for 10,000 years. Humans, right? I'm not going to say
Whoa.
humans
Yeah.
haven't, right? But
Yeah.
10,000 years is an interesting number because arguably modern humans, modern, right? As
Yeah.
humans, as society interacts today, not thinking of apes and Neanderthals,
Right.
what's the accepted time frame for that? I want to say it's on the order of 5 to 7,000 years or something like that. Right?
Yeah.
The
It's not
the
that long.
Egyptians were 4,000 years ago, maybe,
Yeah.
and um, so when I think of a 10,000 year machine, we can't keep bearings from going out for more than a couple of years, right? We can't
Yes.
keep material from oxidizing. So that's going back to like the standard kilogram is the reason why it's so hard is if you just left that sitting on a table somewhere and came back 100 years, it would weigh different. It would weigh less just due to natural oxidization of
That's wild.
electrons and atoms ejecting into the surrounding atmosphere. So they have to do things like keep it in an argon encased enclosure to slow down oxidization, right? Like, so thinking of a 10,000 year clock and being able to guarantee that in product development, we have those problems too. Where it's like, how do I prove that this machine will work for 20 years for the military, for example?
Good example.
Somehow we have to speed up the testing to estimate what it will experience in 20 years without waiting 20 years to see if it'll work or not.
Yeah. What's the best way to do that from your perspective?
I mean, there's some proven like Holt-Haas type tests where accelerated life testing, where you're subjecting a machine or a material to elevated levels of salt fog and spray, right, which is an oxidizer or corrosive agent, hot and cold cycles, which subjects it to higher levels of fatigue than just using it normally. So, and just accelerated cycle counts. So, if you've seen, there's like machines in the automotive industry where it's got a sandbag that just slams into a chair or a seat in a car, 100,000 times, just incessantly to try and accelerate like what happens to the seat when someone uses this vehicle for 10 years and gets in and out of it on average twice a day. You can come up with a number of cycles for its life, and then you try and hit it with that many cycles as fast as possible to see what happens over its lifetime without having to wait the real time period. I think IKEA even has a machine where they like open and close cabinet doors, you know, thousands of times to try and determine if they'll last or not.
Oh wow, that's crazy. That's really cool to think about. I'm grateful for engineers and program managers like you because when I was in the military and the equipment that I was fielded, I took this stuff for granted. I rode around in a Stryker ICV, which is an infantry carrying vehicle. It was a relatively new platform, but it had been proven. It had been modified, a couple times since when I got those vehicles. But it essentially took kind of a mixture of commercial off the shelf, although modified engines that were from a Caterpillar motor architecture, and then combined them with kind of what the military had learned from the Humvee program and other armored vehicle programs. And they were just phenomenal vehicles. I mean, hats off to General Dynamics. They make awesome products in general. Any product I've used from them has been excellent. I think they're just dialed in. But I definitely took it for granted that all of the systems that we had, they all worked. I mean, they all just kind of worked. I mean, some of the newer technologies were finicky. Like if they were kind of a new program of record or were funded with R&D dollars from some of the new program offices that were set up in the Pentagon to support some of the emerging threats that we faced in Afghanistan. I thought it was really cool, and I didn't appreciate it. Just all the thought, engineering, design rigor, testing, environmental testing, thermal testing, stress analysis, all of the thousands, maybe millions of man hours that went into these products to make sure that they worked effectively, as long as you maintained them, per the standard. They worked every single time. And that always boggled my mind when when I was in the military. Oh, this stuff is pretty durable. But when I got out, and now that I've been working in and out of the aerospace and defense industry for the last, I don't know, few years since I've got off active duty, I have a much higher appreciation for not only the standard that these acquisition professionals set. They set a very, very high bar, as you know, from a reliability perspective and environmental testing, but also engineers and program managers like you who meet those requirements. You figure out a way to not only meet those requirements but prove it. You got to prove it, right? The government wants you to demonstrate that you can pass the rigorous testing and evaluation that goes into basically a military product. So I don't know. It's kind of cool to see it from both sides.
That's a sliding scale too. Anything to do with humans, the bar is much higher. And
Correct.
that's why you see in certain industries or certain product categories, the incumbent has, it's a lot harder to kick the incumbent out because it's proven technology. So the risk of doing something that might improve performance by fractions of a percent, but at the risk of it not working, is not worth it. I decided a long time ago to go into robotics and unmanned systems because it felt like the pace of innovation could continue accelerating because that bar or that burden of entry wouldn't be as high like you see in commercial aviation, although there's some challenges going on in that space right now
There
as
is.
we're recording this. Medical industry, right? I was listening to something about new diagnostic tool. Actually, one of them's on my wall behind me somewhere.
Cool.
That has some proof that it would be beneficial, but the adoption and the trust of the industry to use it is very hard to overcome because you have these highly trained people that have been using these tools and are calibrated to understand their benefits and their consequences, whereas something new doesn't have that pedigree, even though it has the potential to be an improvement. The ability for it to take hold and be useful in that space is much harder to come by because of that trust piece of it. And then that comes
Yeah.
back to that earlier question of what's it going to be like in 20 years. In my opinion, I don't think it's going to be that much different, just because overcoming that trust and pedigree in product and innovation space is so hard to come by. Now there will be unicorns that break through, right? There always is. Something like the iPhone comes along and changes an entire product category and the way we interact with the world. But those are like once in a generation type of products. I think AI has the potential to be that next world changing product category. But you see how much distrust there is already with people. Just like AI is a 4-letter word. It's like, oh, AI is going to take over the world and Skynet's going to end everything. Like, and that's not going to happen tomorrow.
No, I hope not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not ready yet. I haven't prepped. I haven't prepped enough freeze dried food in the crawl space.
You don't have your
Um,
5-gallon bucket of macaroni and cheese yet.
yeah. Yeah. I think I've got enough food in my house to survive for maybe like the weekend. That's about
Right.
it.
Right.
Yeah, that's cool. I like that. The way you described how you gravitating to robotics and unmanned systems was a deliberate choice for that reason. And I saw that when I was, deployed overseas. We got fielded several unique unmanned ground vehicles, and they were kind of finicky. And I don't think there was a lot of emphasis in, necessarily the design rigor or the human safety factor. It was more like get this equipment to the troops now. That was the emphasis, and they made an immediate impact on the safety of our troops. And so I think if there's something like that where, and these were remote controlled, devices,
Hmm.
remote controlled unmanned ground vehicles. And so I think, yeah, the emphasis was maybe less so on the safety because you don't have anybody riding in it, or it's not really strapped to someone's body. Yeah, there probably wasn't as much emphasis put on that. It was probably like, this is going to have an immediate positive impact.
It's a risk
Let's get
versus
it to the
value
troops.
proposition,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
So if the risk is relatively low and the value proposition is high, even if the confidence in that value proposition is low, it's worth it to try.
Totally. Yeah, you're spot
Whereas if
on.
the risk is high, think human spaceflight, right? Then, and the consequences are high if it doesn't work perfectly, then the rigor required to even see that technology in the outside world is much higher. And there's a lot of pride in being able to field one of those systems, right? But I decided early on. Originally I was going to design fighter jets. I'm like, yep, that's so cool. I'm
Cool.
going to do that. And I think Joint Strike Fighter was like in the middle of its development when I was in school. But it became very clear to me that if I tried to get on one of those programs, I'd be like the landing gear nut guy for the first 10 years of my career,
That's correct. Yeah,
right?
probably. Most likely. Yeah.
And so I wanted to be able to have a higher level impact and be able to engage in full life cycle product development uh, much sooner in my career to be able to have greater influence and learn more things. That's where that jack of all trades kind of comes in versus being like the world renowned expert on the landing gear nut.
Wow. And you've done all that in your career from my perspective. From where I'm sitting, you've done that successfully. And I cannot wait to see what you do next. I'm so excited. And yeah, I was talking to somebody at West Point about exactly what you just said. They said in order for a human, like a system that directly interfaces with a soldier, even if someone comes up with an idea or a widget that's like 10 or 20% better than the legacy system, that's not good enough for the government to give it any attention. That's not
Mm-hmm.
good enough. It's got to be like an
Yep.
order of magnitude better. Then they're interested. But if there's a system that's been, even some of the stuff I used was like designed in the Vietnam era, but it works. It's reliable. Obviously, it's been upgraded. The battery technology associated with it has been upgraded, but like the infrastructure and the architecture to some of these electric devices and mechanical devices that we use, they still use the same connection pins. They still use the same wiring. It's a lot of the same like mil spec interfaces that we're familiar with because it just works. It just works, and it's been proven through multiple conflicts that U.S. soldiers have served in over the last 40 years. And with regards to the really good example of human spaceflight that you mentioned, I listened to an interview. I think it was on the Lex Friedman podcast, but Jeff Bezos was on the Lex Friedman podcast. Really good interview. I don't think Jeff Bezos does a lot of public interviews, so that was kind of unique. And he said that the emergency separation system. So I think it's probably the flight envelope is probably from takeoff, maybe before you get to low Earth orbit. That mechanism, that safety mechanism that breaks away the capsule from the rest of the rocket, was so critical, and he obsessed over it so much that it took as much engineering bandwidth and man hours and money to design that safety system as it did the rest of the whole entire,
Mm-hmm.
rocket capsule, everything else combined. So it was like a 1-to-1 ratio. Like the safety system, how much time and effort it took to design was in direct 1-to-1 ratio. Maybe not exactly, but that's the way he described it. And it's also automated. There's no like emergency. I'm thinking in my head,
Yeah.
you pull
Nobody
like a
pulls
fire
the
alarm.
handle. Yeah.
Yeah. There's none of that because it wouldn't be
Yeah.
quick enough. A human wouldn't be able to react quick enough. And I think we'll
Right.
see that. I think that is one area of improvement that we'll see in everyday life: driving, flying, riding a train. I think there'll be safety systems in place that humans are flawed in this way. Like we're sometimes you're tired, sometimes
Mm-hmm.
you're not paying attention. I think there will be safety systems in place to prevent human error, or prevent catastrophes that are outside of humans' control.
or augment human capabilities, right? Not replace human capabilities, but augment them or enhance them.
Yep. No, I think you're right. I think yeah, it'll be interesting to see. One of the interesting products I've seen, demonstrated. I think Elon Musk started doing Neuralink testing, probably through computer-aided modeling, and then I think he's done it in certain animals too, and then now humans. And I think the going back to the risk-reward thing that's a great topic to talk about. I think the Neuralink, which for those who are not aware, it's basically think like a brain chip that's implanted in your brain and augments the way that your neurons communicate with your central nervous system. So like the initial use case that would have a high degree of benefit to the human, albeit still a high risk, would be someone that is paralyzed. Let's say someone got into a car accident and they severed one of their cervical vertebrae in the neck, and they can no longer move their legs. Right? I'm just using a hypothetical example, but this is something that I think would be a good application for this type of technology. Let's say now that you implant the Neuralink system, I don't even know how they do it. I don't know if it's in the cerebrum, the brainstem, maybe it reconnects the connection between the cervical, you know, neurons that are connected to through your vertebrae, your spinal cord. But I'm thinking, what if that person can now walk again? Or think of another person that's maybe blind or deaf. If you can use a system like Neuralink to give that person sight or hearing or the ability to walk again, that could be a potential. I see that a potential in that.
Oh, definitely. It's bridging gaps that we at one point assumed were, and an example of that in the not too distant past was some of these sicknesses that humans just assumed, right? You ever play Oregon Trail and you're like, oh, you got
Oh yes,
dysentery and you're
yeah,
dead, right? When was the last time you heard of anybody dying from dysentery? Or right, like or just some of these sicknesses that um, if you got sick twice in your lifetime at some point in history, you didn't survive. But now we're seeing new illnesses because we're living so long, which just then
totally.
moves the needle, let alone all the accidents and those sorts of things that would shorten an otherwise healthy life and change it drastically.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that we live in a time period, especially here in the U.S., where this is probably the safest. Not it's not unique to the U.S. There's other countries in this category that actually, ironically, have a higher life expectancy. They have a higher life expectancy than us. But we've really never lived, where you and I sit outside two major metropolitan cities in the U.S. There's never really been a safer time to be a human. It's kind of a unique period in human history where we're not faced with constant threats either by other apex predators or competing tribes. I mean, we're kind of in a unique situation where, and coupled with medical technology, it might not be that far fetched to think that humans could start living past 100 as kind of the default. That might be a possibility in the very near future where it won't be uncommon to celebrate someone's 120th birthday.
I think it won't be uncommon necessarily, but I don't think it'll be comfortable. Tying it back to your 10,000 year clock question, the human machine was designed, I'm using that very loosely, uh, for a finite number of cycles.
Yeah, it was.
And eventually the parts wear out.
They do.
Now, Neuralink or do you ever see that Robin Williams movie, Centennial Man, where they like replaced all of his parts and turned him into a robot, but
Yeah.
he had an artificial heart, lungs,
Yep.
limbs, like the brain was the only thing left. Um, Eventually, like the tissue wears out, and humans are a machine at almost every level, right? It's a combination of subsystems that work together to achieve an action. Um, and there's some guys trying to prolong their lives indefinitely through healthy habits and such, but um, eventually the parts wear out, um, and it becomes very uncomfortable. So it'll be interesting to see if I don't disagree that the average won't move. I'm interested to see how comfortable that existence is, or if there's a sweet spot that we'll end up falling into.
I never considered that. I mean, if this is me, just now approaching middle age and having to take, a couple Advil, the day after I spend the day at the bunny slopes with my kids. So I took my kids skiing on Wednesday and, nothing crazy. I don't even know if we did more than 6 or 7 runs total, maybe a few more than that, but it was mostly on the bunny hill. And, you know, when I had my first kid, I didn't feel these types of pains that I feel when I wake up. I mean, I've stayed relatively healthy, thank goodness. I haven't had any major medical issues, but I never considered. So I know I've been really lucky, to be in this community of people that served our country and all the people that have supported, the DoD and everything that they do. And so I've met people who have had life-altering injuries where, the doctor said initially that they weren't going to walk again. I want to get him on the podcast. I don't want to mention his name until he gets on the podcast. But there's one guy in particular that it was really impactful for me. This guy is just getting after it every single day. And I thought he was probably 15 years younger than he actually is. He's like 65 and he's still running, doing CrossFit. And I was talking to him about his experience. He was a career infantryman. So heavy rucksacks, lots of load bearing equipment, long walks with this equipment in austere mountainous environments, all environments really. He served in multiple conflicts of the modern era that the DoD has been involved in. And I was like, wow, I was like, you look amazing. Like I had no idea you were that old. I had no idea that you were still getting after it like you have. He looks the part though. He looks like a straight GI Joe action figure at age 65. I hope I look half as good as him. And he was like, yeah. And he started going through all the different titanium body parts that were, embedded underneath his tissue, knees, hips, shoulders. They're not all titanium. It's kind of an amalgamation of titanium and polymers, most likely. And he's got an electric stimulator on his spine. That was, the doctor that said he wasn't going to walk again. They implanted, I don't know, you can probably speak to this better than I can, but it's essentially a battery powered, like, spine stimulator, a spinal cord stimulator. I'm like, I've never heard of this. This guy really is a living version of the Centennial Man. Mm-hmm. So have you heard of these stimulators that are implanted underneath the skin? I could see it protruding through his back. It looked like a small, NiCad battery. That was kind of the form factor.
Someone we used to work with works there now. I don't know a lot about the tech, but I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So it essentially, just like an ablation device can, add electrical signals to portions of the heart, or pacemaker is probably a better example, can stimulate, certain parts of the heart, because the heart is a really important muscle that, is obviously critical, that you couldn't live without it for more than a minute. But with his case, it was more of a factor of his comfort and the way his body was able to move. Mm-hmm. And so I think he was one of those guys, which is just so inspiring to me, that just has this, he's a force of nature, and he proved every single surgeon, medical professional, orthopedic surgeon, he proved all of them wrong. I mean, not only is he walking again, but he's running, right, and lifting weights. And he's like, yep, I got to look the part, because he's still involved in the community. He's still involved in the military community. So from his perspective, he wants to set a good example for the young men and women that are coming up through the ranks, that no, this is, you got to look the part. You got to be out there with the men, and lead from the front. Oh, I'm getting chills just thinking about this guy. I'm going to go see him in a couple weeks. So I'm going to try to, hopefully he'll say yes. He's kind of a very humble guy, but I really want to tell his story because he's has such a big impact on me. So, but yeah, he's the Centennial Man, like, in the flesh.
Yeah. No, I think that kind of stuff will be more common for sure. Right. Where you had some catastrophic injury that changed the course of the rest of your life, and now you're either wheelchair bound or, and all of that has psychological impacts as well, right? Where you were otherwise happy and cruising through life as the average citizen, and then this thing happened, and now all of a sudden there's depression and relationship issues and everything else that can detract from an otherwise average happy existence. And some of these new technologies can prevent the catastrophic downstream effects of something that in the past we just had to accept as like, well, drew the short straw. That's how it is, I guess.
Yeah, you're right. No, that's really well said. Speaking of relationships, one thing I'm curious, and this will be really valuable for folks out there that are either starting their engineering career or maybe they're taking up a program management role or a project manager role. How do you build meaningful relationships with your customers, your R&D staff, other internal stakeholders at the various organizations you've worked with? I feel like you're really good at this. I feel like you're just, and I'm sure you've worked your butt off to attain these types of skills. But for someone that's kind of about to take some really big steps in their career that are going to require them to be more more customer facing or just leading an IPT, what are some things that have helped you?
I try and approach any of these professional relationships as a partnership, whether it's a team I'm leading or a customer I'm serving. Um, the hierarchy doesn't bring a whole lot to the table. And I know there's certain industries, military specifically, where that hierarchy is assumed because the the speed and criticality of decision making almost lends itself to it. Like you don't want to be guessing who's going to make the decision. The decision just needs to be made automatically so you can move on to the next challenge. But in my professional life in the business world, nothing is really that critical where uh, some level of partnership can't be attained. And so with my customers, I want to be their partner to achieve their objective. I don't want to be seen as a supplier or a vendor or somebody that needs to be told exactly what to do or I'm not going to do it. I want to be proactive and anticipate their needs. It goes back to earlier when we were talking about resilience. Like I don't want to ever be surprised or feel surprised. And that builds trust, right? And relationships are all about trust at the end of the day, whether it's personal or professional. And so if you act as a partner and when you're leading teams, I take kind of the servant leader type of mantra where my goal is for my team members to be successful, whether that means completing their task on time or completing it with a high enough quality or getting them the resources they need to be successful.
Yes.
Um, and and my goal is to remove excuses, and I use excuses pretty loosely as well, not not as a crutch to say like, well, it's somebody else's fault on why they didn't get done, but let's be proactive and determine what roadblocks we might encounter to reduce surprises later. Because if we know what roadblocks might come, I can be ready for when those roadblocks inevitably do appear, and the time to react to that roadblock and recover from it is shortened because I already had some of the thinking on how I would deal with it completed versus a surprise where you didn't know this could ever possibly happen. So we don't even know where to start to recover, right? There's a delay there.
That's not a good place to be, what you just said. But yeah, what you said before that is incredible. Like being able to, not only foster an environment for your team to be successful, but also remove any roadblocks, excuses, give your team a clear runway. And that's really important. And when I worked with you, I was, as a young business development professional, I'm still pretty early on in my career. I was like, from my perspective, I was like, it seems like Stefan can predict the future. I was like, you almost have this crystal ball where like you almost knew customer even said it. You're like, you had an answer already. I mean, you didn't, you listened. A lot of people kind of wait for their turn to speak. You never did that, but you always just had like a well thought answer that I felt you just like pulled out of nowhere. And you didn't pull it out of nowhere, which really impressed me. And it always, from my perspective, gave the customer a great deal of confidence, which was really cool to see because it demonstrated that you had put a lot of thought into this. Using your really really incredible vast engineering experience, PM experience, but you were able to present a few different options that were all potentially suitable to meet their requirements. But yeah, I always like was amazed by that. I was like, man, it's like Stefan just like can he either read minds or predict the future? That's what it appeared like to me. So
I do spend a decent amount of my working time thinking about what challenges could come up. And again, I'm not the super technical expert on any one focus area, but from a system level and a customer perception or product perception level, I try and spend some percentage of my time, and a lot of time it's not constructive time. It's like driving in the car or the proverbial shower thought, um, is, all right, I've got a meeting with a customer next week and I haven't given them an answer on the lead time for these parts yet. I can probably guess what one of the questions they're going to ask during that meeting is going to be.
yep.
So I can either find the answer and head off that meeting and send it to them in advance, or be prepared to answer it with confidence when they inevitably ask it in the meeting. Or what is more likely is we don't know yet, and I need to kick off some proactive activities to try and work our way through that problem so that it doesn't look like we haven't even started when the question's asked.
Yeah. That's something I've really worked hard to try to do with me and my team. I don't like to be surprised by customer questions that just kind of inherently just pop up. So I spend a great deal of time before those types of customer engagements thinking through what potential challenges, pain points, long lead items that are going to be perceived as high risk items and from the customer's perspective, and could potentially slow down or inhibit their ability to reach their goals. You want to make the customer look good, right? I mean, you want to make them look good for other stakeholders in their organization, their leadership, their boss. That's really important to me. Is that, and so we always take a deliberate effort to kind of walk through every piece of technology and put ourselves in the customer's shoes, call it empathy, and try to understand from their perspective what's important to them. And I would encourage anybody who's customer facing, whether you're doing BD work, PM work, or a mix of the two. There's a lot of roles that are unique in the DoD space that are you kind of do a little bit of both, as you know. Think through that and put yourself in their shoes, like really put yourself in their shoes, and try to better understand where the customer's coming from, and you use the tools that are on the side of your head, your ears, your oral canals to listen, and really really listen, not just to what they're saying, but the way they're saying it. If you have the pleasure of being on video or in person, look at their body language. I think it's really important, and it just makes the whole product development process so much faster.
100%.
What Going back to robotics, what really excites you about either the future of robotics or some of the projects you've worked on in the past where you're like, man, this could be like a really cool benefit to society, or it could change the way that humans interact with the world? Like what excites you about the future of robotics? And this is a general question that you can take any way you want. I mean, it's
In robotics, there's something called the 3Ds, the dull, dirty, and dangerous. What excites me about robotics in the future is the application of uh, technology to the dull, dirty, and dangerous challenges. And those are things that humans are not well suited for. So think of repetitive actions, boring types of activities, and activities that would do harm to humans. They're not well suited for the environment or the task or whatever it may be. And that's where I don't see robotics as necessarily being a replacement for human talent, but that augmentation. And where can we apply human talents more effectively based on the things that they're good at? Now that will evolve over time, right? Everybody was worried about the invention of the elevator because it would put all the automatic elevator because it would put all the elevator operators out of work. Arguably, was that a good use of human talent to stand in a box and push buttons, right? We have the most powerful control system, the brain on the planet. Even arguably, the lowest tier performing humans are still orders of magnitude stronger than any other living organism on the planet, and even a lot of the the technology and machines that we've come up with. So applying those talents more effectively on a societal basis uh, is better bang for your buck. But robotics can come in and fill those gaps, and robotics can enable things that previously we were unable to do. So think about remote control submersibles. That wouldn't be possible without that type of robotic technology. And I use robotics pretty loosely in that way. The vehicles we drive today would not be possible without robotics because of the repetitive motion that leads to higher quality uh, parts creation and fabrication and assembly processes. Um, that type of automation cannot be achieved through human capital.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and think dirty, dull, dangerous. What comes to mind is seeing people in a nuclear power plant wearing radiological suits. And this is an extreme example that is probably not done by humans anymore, but removing rods from the coolant, or changing out coolant from a nuclear
It
reactor.
is still done.
Oh my gosh.
My brother works in a nuclear power plant, and they're starting to adopt robotics because if they need to shut a nuclear power plant down for, let's call it a day, to go into a contained zone and fix a valve or inspect a possible leak or recover something that broke, they're losing millions of dollars for that time period that it's shut down. Whereas a robotic system like Spot can go can go in while it's still active, and even if it was destroyed by the nuclear activity that's in there, the radiation, and had to be scrapped, that's a $50,000 to $100,000 system versus the millions of dollars. So even just on a financial level, ignoring the health and safety side of it completely, it can often make financial sense to use these types of systems rather than having to go through the risk reward processes to guarantee human safety. And a lot of times it's still not a guarantee. Like um, when they're doing repairs on those facilities, they'll go through a few hundred welders, like humans, during that time period because their exposure limits are controlled
Wow.
so tightly that
Oh my
one welder
gosh.
can't work in that environment for very long, and they have to fly in these welders from all over the country to try and spread out the potential exposure to radiation at safe levels.
Whoa. Okay, I didn't know any of this. This is really cool. And I don't know much about modern nuclear reactors other than they're a critical piece of the infrastructure here in the U.S. I know they're blanketed. That whole industry is blanketed with intense regulatory guidance, probably from the EPA, probably from the Department of Energy mainly. Have you seen the HBO series Chernobyl?
I have, yeah.
What do you think of that?
That was pretty cool to see how they I mean they had to go in and re-encapsulate that facility, right?
Yeah, I think eventually, and I might be getting my nuclear reactor disasters mixed up, but what there was two things. I think eventually a French company encapsulated it with like a just mountains of cement.
Hmm.
I think I don't know if it was a French company, but I think some company eventually encapsulated it. It was like a multi-billion-dollar project. It was a ridiculously expensive project. But I think one of the things that I found really fascinating about kind of the human factors and what went wrong with that reactor is probably related to what you mentioned, is that the financial consequences of the reactor being shut down for longer than it had to be, or what the leadership perceived it had to be, was one of the reasons why that accident happened. From my and I have limited knowledge. I don't have any intimate knowledge about Chernobyl. Some of my friends are really into it, and know a lot more than I do. But they like deliberately would skip some of the safety steps that were related to shutting the reactor down or some of the procedures, because I think there was a lot of pressure from some of the leadership in that country to maybe to speed things up, make it faster. We don't want any breaks in wattage. Did you gather that too? That there was like maybe not there was some pressure to kind of cut corners, maybe.
I think you can look at a lot of disasters in our history or 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 challenges as having the roots in that sort of domain, right? Pressures for something that wasn't that consequential in the grand scheme that resulted in huge consequences.
Yeah,
Um, my favorite activity to do, over beers or with a group of young engineers is, and I've almost broken a couple young engineers doing this, but um, sometimes I'll find myself just zooming out in my mind's eye, like
yeah,
like if you're sitting in your house or driving on a highway, what's your effective region of influence? What if you were on the space station? Like, okay, you can't even see anybody's house anymore. What if you were on the moon? You can't even really tell the difference between countries and land masses. And if you zoom out even further, Earth is, a blip in the universe.
yeah. It
So
is.
does the fact that this person cut me off or that we saved a few bucks on this project matter? But then you have to very quickly zoom back in,
Yeah,
because if you
sure.
live in that nothing matters zone, that's not a good place to live. But to gather perspective on a situation, I'll often do that in order to help me decide, you know, how much effort to put in, how big a deal is this problem that we're trying to solve, um, what's the red line that I want to operate under from a moral, ethical, safety standpoint, and try and always keep perspective on decisions.
Yeah, I love that perspective, and that resonates with me in a very specific way that I want to share. When I was transitioning off active duty, as a combat leader in the army who was forward deployed on the front lines, my emotional investment in the people I worked with, and then the tactical situations that we were in, was so high. I mean, it consumed my whole life. I mean, it was,
Mm-hmm.
we were working every single day, 7 days a week, sometimes 24 hours a day, popping caffeine pills and probably using too much smokeless tobacco. I'm speaking for me personally, but yeah, anything to stay awake. And so when I was removed from that environment and transitioned off active duty, it was hard for me to decouple my work. I had an awesome company I worked for when I transitioned. They were incredible. And luckily, I had a few veterans. One was a CH-53 pilot in the Marine Corps. There was one guy who was a leader in the Navy. So I worked with a few veterans, and one of them, one of my directors pulled me aside and said, and because he could tell I was like stressed out about,
Hmm.
I don't even remember what it was. I couldn't even tell you what it was, but it
Yeah.
was something in business that just shows how insignificant it was. And he said, hey, he's like, don't worry about this. This is not life or death. It's not life or death. And I was like, oh, and basically what he was framing it as, let's say, I'm going to make up an example because I can't remember. He's like, if the customer doesn't buy the product, it's not the end of the world. I think I was just putting a lot of pressure on myself to perform in that new role. And I was,
Right. Or
initially,
anything less than perfect is failure, right?
yeah, or death. Yeah.
Right.
Or yeah. Yeah. So yeah, no, you're right. And it's not like that in the business world. I mean, there's certainly safety critical, just designs that there should be a lot of emphasis and checks and balances and regulatory guidance that should be adhered to. But, not when I was doing commercial sales for, products that were arguably optional, right? I wasn't, selling any life critical medical devices so I thought that was a really interesting perspective, and it relates to what you said so perfectly. Because if you zoom out and frame the problem from a higher altitude, call it, I think people's perspective will shift. And we're fortunate in this country and in the modern world and any developed nation in the Western world that our problems really aren't that significant if you think about it. I mean, the daily problems that someone cutting you off is a great example, because arguably people commuting to and from work causes a great deal of stress. It just does. I mean, it
Hmm.
stresses out. I mean, you're using, you know, 3 out of 4 of your appendages. You're, you're trying to pay attention to other cars at a high speed. You're trying to ignore your cell phone. Hopefully, you guys are ignoring your cell phone. You're trying to turn up the music. Humans weren't necessarily optimized for that function, or even if someone's just rude to you. I like to zoom out and try to give people the benefit of the doubt. Like, maybe that person is like going through the worst time in their life, and this is like their way of lashing out. I think people, I don't know, maybe people deserve more empathy from my perspective.
100%. You have to assume that nobody woke up in the morning, said, "Today I'm going to go cut somebody off on the highway."
On
Right? Like,
purpose.
who does that? And there's some people that are arguably like not as nice as others, right? Um, and they should be. They should try. You shouldn't make your problems other people's problems necessarily.
Yeah.
But um, you know, having the ability to slough off some stress and in the traffic situation recognize that nobody wronged me, nobody ran my car off the road or injured me or changed significantly the time it took me to get where I was going. Like that's just a function of the activity that I'm participating in is going to have to deal with that. Um, and so, not harboring that as long-term stress. Like there's short-term stress and long-term stress, and being able to evacuate the short-term stress in short order so that it doesn't inhibit your ability to deal with long-term stress, I think is an important life skill, whether you're a young student, a young professional, or in your prime, or even just dealing with children. Right? There's going to be short-term stresses constantly raising children, but you don't want to turn that into a long-term stress that changes your relationships.
Yeah, it's so true. You can build a great reputation either with someone or in an industry for a lifetime. And your reputation and the way people perceive you, and the way people react to you being in the room or on a teleconference, it matters. It really matters to me. And I've really worked hard to get out of that frame of thinking that I shared with you earlier about, oh my gosh, everything's life or death. And that was my reality for a period of time as a young man. And now I really make a deliberate effort to give people the benefit of the doubt, and really come more from a perspective of empathy and thinking, man, maybe this person is going through a really hard time, or maybe they need help. That's another way to frame it too.
Yeah.
If you have if you have a colleague, and this is true for anybody out there, if you have a colleague or or a family member or a spouse that's, maybe not treating you exactly the way that you would like, or maybe they're dropping the ball on a project, offer to help. I've really, once I changed my frame of thinking and it was more from like hey, let's offer to help. Let me buy them a coffee and talk to them like a human being. Let's connect like human beings. And we spend too much time connecting over keyboards and Logitech webcams and microphones. And let's actually sit down together and talk. And I think you'll be shocked. Well, you won't be. I'm not speaking to you personally, Stefan, but I think people would be shocked at the reaction they get if you frame it up like that. Because sometimes the person just needs someone to listen and help, and it could change their entire world.
It's actually my go-to question when I notice somebody's not meeting expectations or not performing as expected. I won't typically say, when are you going to be done with that? I'll say, hey, do you need any help to get that done?
And you mean it.
Can I come down and help turn wrenches, or can I help you think through a problem? And oftentimes they'll either think to themselves, no, I got this, but somebody's paying attention, so let's buckle down. Or, yeah, I'm stuck, I don't know what to do. Or, I'm way behind, this isn't working as I expected. And you start to elicit some information or some feedback that you wouldn't have gotten if you went in hard, because they would have clammed up or felt threatened and said, no, I'll take care of it, right? And now they're working all weekend or something and making mistakes.
Yep.
And that's not the objective. The objective is to finish the effort with reasonable or good enough quality, right? Whatever that definition of quality is, within the boundaries of the project as best possible.
Oh, I love that so much. Yeah, and I think your reputation in any organization you've been a part of, when you ask someone how can I help, they know that Stefan means it. They know that you mean it when you say that, because it's one thing to speak those words, and then it's a totally different thing to take action and actually help that person in a meaningful way, whether that be turning a wrench or offloading some of the project and kind of helping them with some of the things that maybe they're not as strong in, or teaching them a new skill to put in their utility belt. That's one thing I really like to do. That's one thing I'm passionate about. That's so cool. In an effort to make this podcast, or whatever you want to call it, this podcast more conversational, I always like to reserve the last portion of the podcast for you to ask any questions of me. It could be related to this media project. It could be related to really anything you'd like. I mean, there's no really anything you want to talk about. I'm really trying to make an effort to make this more conversational than just me grilling you with questions, even though you're so good at it. You're so good at giving answers. I would love to have you on again, but we've talked for an hour and a half, so I want to reserve the last portion to open up the floor for questions that you have.
I've listened to most of the podcasts you've put out already, I think, but I don't know, and you may have explained this, but I don't know if you did. Where'd Tech 45 come from?
Yeah, so Tech 45. So initially, when I was going to start a YouTube channel, I was like, and this is really, looking back on it, it's kind of dumb from my perspective, but I was like, oh, I want to do like little 45-second videos on technology, whether it be,
Okay.
Consumer electronics or just a cool jet that I really like the SR-71. I was like, I'm going to do 45-second tech videos. So that's my lizard brain was like, oh yeah, let's just call it Tech 45. And then it started to evolve from there, where I was like, well, first of all, it's kind of, I just like the number 45. It's kind of like rolls off the tongue. And it's easy to remember, even though one of my buddies pointed out that I'm not the only Tech 45 podcast. There's some in Europe, but whatever. Who knows if they're copyrighted or not. But there's a lot of Tech 45. They're totally unrelated. And then I was like, oh, another cool theme to explain would be like, what will life be like in 2045? Because I thought that was kind of a cool line in the sand. We're approaching 2025, and so that's kind of related to my question to you earlier. Was 20 years from now, I think it'll be hard for most, even smart people like you. It'll be really hard for anybody to fathom, when our kids are our age, right?
Hmm.
what will life look like for them? And we can think about it, from a conceptual level, based on the pace of technology and computer aided and AI enabled design or iterations that are just going to be rapid. Like you'll be able to pursue not, what would normally take an IPT, 6 months to explore three different design paths. You might be able to plug in an AI enabled algorithm and explore like 6 million design paths.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? And that's an extreme example that's hard to comprehend. That's even weird saying that.
That's happening now. I mean,
Yeah, it
that's the
is. It
only
is.
reason we're getting, like, that's the only reason we got COVID vaccinations as fast as we did, is because
Yep.
of the power of computational iteration to find, not to find the solution, but to find viable solution paths that humans can better spend their time exploring rather than guessing and checking with finite number of resources. That, to me, that is the, going back to your question on what's the most impactful thing in the next 20 years, I think that the application of machine learning and algorithmic iteration to find viable solution paths for humans to explore and exploit is probably what will change the world the most.
I think you're absolutely right. And one of my other guests, John, who's just like a genius like you, he said the same thing with regards to material science. He said that, let's say you're trying to design a new turbine blade, and you want this turbine blade to just have a longer life, be less resistant to corrosion, be more resistant to to higher temperatures, different types of fuels, different types of salt water environments, whatever. You can now, what maybe would take a whole team of material scientists and engineers, decades, literally, quite literally decades to optimize. That those iterations might take, 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's a real. I think that's happening. I think he said the same thing as you. Like that's happening like as we speak, and that can be applied to noble causes as well as not so noble causes. So
Mm-hmm.
I think AI can just like the internet, and that was another reason kind of another. It's not exactly what you asked, but one of the other reasons I wanted to start this podcast was that there was just so much junk on the internet, right? And I find myself, going down these YouTube rabbit holes too. And so this is my effort. This is my, lame attempt at trying to counterbalance all the junk that's out there. And for someone who is, interested in pursuing a career in engineering or technology, I want them to have a totally free, open source, not tied to any sort of advertisements or corporate entity. I want them to have a totally genuine, free resource in the form of these types of conversations to reference if they want to, and for me to reference too, because the human brain is great at coming up with ideas, not so great at storing them. I don't know if you've some people are, but
I mean, that's a limitation, right? I think there's some figures out there that we only use like 15% of our brain's capacity or something like that. Um, and the Rolodex fills up pretty quickly, right? And so
it does.
I joke with my wife all the time that, there's certain things that my brain just doesn't have room to store indefinitely. So it gets filed out real quick. And I don't particularly have the best long-term archive. I know some people do.
I
My
don't even
wife
know.
in particular does. She has this ability to dig into the archives, and some smell or sound or word will trigger a memory that gets brought up from the depths. Um, Whereas my archives are pretty much a, a chute to the landfill.
Same. Yeah. I maybe I daydream too much, but if I don't write it down, and I'm so grateful that I took the time to deliberately write stuff down starting in my 20s, and I don't do it every day. I don't do it as often as I probably should, but it's good. I would encourage everyone out there to document not only your successes and your ideas and all the positive things in your life, but if you're going through a difficult time, whether it be through your relationships, professionally, personally, you're starting a business or a new career path, document your failures too. I think it's interesting to look back on my failures and be able to reframe those in a way which Stefan said, where you zoom out and you're like, man, that problem would be like that wouldn't even bother me at all. Given
Wouldn't
what
even
I
make the top 10.
yeah, like if someone did that, like let's use example, like someone talking behind your back, whatever. Like 7 years ago, I'd be like, that would really be hurtful. And now, since I've reframed the way I think about things and the way I think about people, and one of my former bosses in the army told me this. He was like, "Oh yeah," because I remember calling him and being upset about this. Saying, "Oh, someone talks behind my back." He was like, "Well, did they say it to your face?" And I was like, "No." He's like, "Do you think they would be willing to say it to your face?" And I was like, "No, probably not." He's like, "Well, it doesn't matter. Like it means nothing. It's just petty. Like you can't don't let it bring you down." And it was so encouraging. I'm glad I called him. So now, if that happened today, I would be like, man, I don't even care. Not that I don't care. I think it's wrong still, but it wouldn't affect my mood. I wouldn't let it affect my mood.
Right.
So I don't know. But I've really enjoyed talking to you. I knew I would. You and I always have like really cool conversations, but you are
It's always
welcome.
a pleasure.
Yeah, you are welcome back here anytime you want. I mean, you can to
Thank
talk
you,
about
sir.
any topic you want. I'm excited for you and the impact that you're going to have, not only in what you're doing, whatever you're doing now, but in the future. I think you make a really positive impact anywhere you go. And you're the type of person that's, I'd like to have in my life because you leave everything and everyone better than the way you found them. And I mean that. Now that's you're kind of on my short list of people I'd love to work with again, selfishly. And one quote that I want to share with my 7 listeners or 8 listeners is that one quote that you said to me last weekend, which kind of frames, I think it kind of frames the way you pursue your career objectives or your career path,
Mhm.
is you want to work on products that matter with people that care. I might have butchered that, but yeah, work on products that matter with people that care, I think is what you said.
That's the litmus test is, and it's kind of a little bit of a life ethos is I want to I want to engage on things that matter with people that care. And if anything I'm looking to do passes that litmus test, then there's a good chance I'll be able to navigate any of the challenges or interactions within that space without regret.
Dude, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your
Thank
wisdom
you.
with
This was
with
fun.
the people that are. Oh, it was fun, and like I said, you're welcome to come on anytime. And thank you, Stefan.
Thanks, Jack.